All right. And it is 7:05, so I guess we better get started. Well, I mean, it's probably all kinds of times and not 7:05, but 5 past the hour, I would say. So welcome, everybody. Thank you for joining the session of the interest group for physical samples and collections in the research data ecosystem. It was sort of a last-minute decision that we also moved into the virtual world of conferences and are holding this session virtually. I think it's for us all, it's still a bit of an uncharted terrain to have enough interaction. We're used to listening to presentations online, but not necessarily having good discussions, and we strongly would like to encourage you to try it out, to put your comments into the chat, to raise your hand if you have something to say, yell or write in capital letters if it doesn't work and we don't pay attention. In some way we hopefully we'll get there and hear you and can answer or get others to answer to the questions. So with that, let me get started. My name is Kerstin Lehnert, for those who may not know me, because I don't see the full list of people, so I don't know if you all know me. I've been the co-chair of this interest group since its beginning, actually since the time we ran the Birds of Feathers. We noticed at our last session that we ran in Helsinki that there were quite a number of new people, and we hadn't really prepared to talk a little bit, to give that introduction to this interest group, to its goals and drivers. And so we thought we better do that this time and get started that way. So at the very beginning here of the agenda, we have the introduction and tour de table. And as far as I am aware, we have a document set up where we would like to ask everybody, instead of, introducing themselves, which might be a challenge in some cases, that you fill that spreadsheet out with your name and affiliation, and specifically with a few words about the type of samples that you manage or that you're interested in. Leslie, do you want to add anything to that, because you set that up?
Yes, thank you very much for reminding me. I have failed miserably. I meant to put in what type of sample. I will just do that now. Okay, so you keep talking. Yes, I know you told me to do it. I'm sorry I didn't do it.
No problem. So I will look at it when I can, when I'm not sharing my screen anymore. But I hope that everybody can take a look at that list and thus know a little bit about who is online, what type of domains are represented in the audience. So with that, I am going to start with the introduction about the interest group. So this interest group has been put in place because we have actually a substantial number of domains and obviously researchers who in the research that they're doing, in the science that they're pursuing, they need to work with physical samples that are absolutely essential to do measurements in the lab, to take snapshots of nature back into the lab. And these samples are studied and generate data. And so that's where we have to have a link between these physical samples and the digital data that are made available after they have been studied. And so the rationale here is that sample data that are generated need to be reproducible, and for that to be realized, we need to have a connection between the data and the samples, which requires a link based on a unique identifier that ensures that any information about the sample and the data about the sample can be unambiguously linked, and those even back to publications. The samples themselves actually, in the context of reproducibility as well as reusability, need to be findable and accessible. So they need to be actually present on the internet. They need to have a virtual representation that is online, accessible, and integrated into into a world of findable data. Last but not least, collecting samples and curating these samples is clearly a scholarly contribution to the research endeavor, and therefore samples need to be properly cited so that those who have collected them and who curate them can get credit for that. So the goal that we have here is actually, in the first place, to have a place where different stakeholders and different domains can exchange about their practices, learn from each other, and ultimately converge on these best practices. And what is involved is persistent identifiers for samples, our sample metadata and the vocabularies to describe them, and the catalogs, registries, aggregators or harvesters of information about the samples. But we also, besides these more technically oriented issues, we want to think about policies and practices about sample sharing, about sample citation, about sample preservation. And what we haven't started yet, but ultimately need to do, is think a little bit about the physical infrastructure that's necessary to actually make the actual physical objects accessible and preserve them. So the topics that over the years we have been dealing with is we've been trying to identify and characterize existing systems and solutions that are relevant for linking physical samples with research data, with publications, and then identify any gaps that there may be and what challenges need specific attention. As I mentioned, we want to converge, we want to learn from each other, and in that context, we're trying to identify commonalities as well as the divergences or diversities in our stakeholder group. And we want to facilitate the international cooperation in this community of sample collectors, sample analyzers, sample curators, and so on. And ultimately, again, harmonize any practices that exist and make those available to a broad community with specific attention to the identification and digital curation of physical objects. Most of this I mentioned already: facilitate and enable sample registration and sample identification infrastructure. This is a specific, I think, strengths of the RDA to bring in the international community and come up with recommendations how infrastructures can be set up. And on the other hand, when it's more of the organizational boundaries in our sample community. We want to build linkages and better integration among the different stakeholders. And we have a lot of different communities here, including museums and digital data repositories, the publishers, software providers for repositories or museums, and ultimately also, and most importantly, the researchers. So from some of what I said, it's already clear what are the challenges. It's a very diverse community that we have. There are many different stakeholders and different domains that have over the time or want to develop practices and standards around sample identifiers, sample metadata and registries and APIs and so on. But we also have a very fragmented sample community because of these different stakeholders and domains. And that has so far been a problem for establishing technical solutions and policies, procedures, for example, for publishers and for funders that allow a broader, much more streamlined adoption. So we want to build, as a summary, we want to build technical and social bridges among a broad range of stakeholders, and align and coordinate ongoing efforts, strengthen solutions, and broaden their adoption. Very brief, the history, you can see we ran a number of birds of feathers. We had a number of workshops. We have over, four RDA plenaries. We've held sessions that had actually a growing audience, which was very cool to see. And beyond growing in numbers at these sessions, we've had a growing diversity of domains at these sessions. That, I think, is in itself a great success of our efforts. So with that, I'm just going to give a very brief status update for our last session at the Plenary 14 in Helsinki. It was titled Designing a Pathway Towards Implementing a Transdisciplinary Data Infrastructure for Physical Samples. As I said, we had a substantial number of attendees. There was at some point over 40 people in the room who couldn't even find chairs anymore. And what was very exciting was that we had quite a number of new attendees, basically people who had never been to any of our interest group sessions. And we had new domains represented, and among those were engineering samples, samples for renewable materials, so a lot around material sciences, more biology and medical sciences, animal tissues, human tissues. We had more biology represented, archaeological samples, interesting types of water, water handling, water sample handling. It really was a very broad range of participants. So with taking advantage of that diversity, we asked actually participants what is going on in their domains, which standards do they use, do they have standards, best practices, and so on. And the outcome basically was that formal standards are really rare. It's usually, well, we have our own standards. And clearly that triggered a discussion on where can we define what we mean with standard. We, in that context, talked a little bit about the more technical standards, data exchange protocols, and so on, versus the various vocabularies which we feel are at this point one of the most relevant issues to address, to find the common denominator in our vocabularies relevant to describe samples that can be scaled up to accommodate the needs of individual communities as well. Clearly, in the context of ontologies, vocabularies, and so on, is the question who governs these standards, who can actually certify or recommend a best practice or a standard, a convention, and what we figured it's usually done by scientific unions, and this makes it difficult for samples because they exist in many different domains, and we need a different way of bringing people together and getting this governance for sample related conventions and standards. We had a brief update on this IGSN 2040 project. For those of you who don't know, the IGSN is a global unique identifier, the global sample number, that has been adopted actually quite broadly already, originated in the earth sciences, but has moved on into biological sciences, archaeology, and so on. And there is currently a project going on to provide a more sustainable infrastructure for the IGSN. We suggested, or we basically requested from the audience to suggest activities that the interest group could do between plenaries. And we wanted to start collecting use cases, but haven't quite gotten to that. And we were looking for additional volunteers to help lead this interest group because we feel it is time for a change in the leadership. And that has also not happened, and I hope we can come back to that item at the end of this meeting. Maybe we stop for a minute and look if there are any questions. Jens, have there been any hands raised or entries in the chat?
No, I don't see anything in the chat at the moment.
If there isn't anything, I mean, we still have quite a ways to go. I will hand over to Leslie Wyburn to briefly give a report on the 2019 Beijing Declaration on Research Data, which I think has an important statement regarding samples that hopefully will raise awareness on the relevance of samples as part of research data ecosystems.
Kirsten?
Leslie. Yes?
Can you keep your screen going? Okay, so can you change the slides? I've only got two anyway.
Okay.
Okay, so if we go to the next slide, this meeting was held in September 2019 in Beijing and was organised by CoData, and it was a 2-day workshop that was held before the 3-day CoData annual meeting in General Assembly. And back one, please.
Oh, sorry, my mouse jumps.
Okay.
Even, I don't even touch it.
Did the cat walk in? Sorry. And CoData has a data policy committee. For those of you who don't know, CoData is the data arm of the International Science Council. So you've got all the scientific unions in physics, chemistry, geology, etc., and social science now. And this is the data committee, and they have a special policy one. And they wanted to discuss current issues on data policies and develop a set of policies that are adapted not just to the new open science paradigm, but also to the fact that we're rapidly moving into the digital world and the world of linked data, etc. And so the key output from it was the Beijing Declaration, which was intended as a timely statement of core principles to encourage global cooperation in data especially for publicly funded research data, not just in government agencies, but also in, sorry, not just in the research community, but also for government agencies. Now, the full declaration is on there. I suggest you have a look at it, and it's all about data. So what's the left field? Why am I talking about this in this session? So you go to the next slide. Yeah, so one of the things that a few of us argued for, and I'd like to thank Andrew Treloar of Australia, because he argued for software to be specified in it, and a certain other Australian and a couple of other people were arguing for samples. So when you read this declaration of data, they actually specify that the word data is not just data, but the ecosystems that relate to data, including metadata, software, algorithms, as well as physical samples and analog artifacts, as well as the digital representations and metadata relating to these things. So that's what we're about. That's about photos, that's about the metadata, okay? And as I said, there are 10 principles. Log in and read the thing if you want to, but they're supporting international efforts to make research data as open as possible and only closed as is necessary. And the principles also cover a lot of things about making data and metadata findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable on a global basis. But the other thing it really emphasizes is wherever possible, automatically processable by machines. So that's just kind of a heads up. It's a bit left field, but I just wanted to alert you to this now public definition of data, which includes physical samples and their digital representations. So any questions on that? Because that's all I had to say. Okay. Well, we might as well move on to the next item, please, on the agenda.
Okay, so am I supposed to continue with this?
Jens was going to take over now, wasn't he?
Yep, I can take over. So let's see, we had the plan was to have a panel discussion, but we're actually not that many people, so we can make this more open, I guess. And we had also invited Ramona Walls and Sean Ross to give us a very brief lightning introduction to what they do with samples and yeah, start the discussion. Kerstin, did we have anybody else? Sorry, from Cyro, nobody could join today.
No, I mean, we had originally, I think 4 people. The only one is kind of me for the geosciences, but I think I mentioned the IGSN already, and I think this is probably sufficient already.
So let's invite Ramona to say something about the samples, and I think we'll have to unmute her, or can you unmute yourself? Oh, good.
How about now?
Yeah.
Yes.
Works.
Okay. Sorry, I muted myself.
Are.
Yeah. Thanks, Jen, Jens, and everyone for inviting me here. I'll just briefly say who I am. My name is Ramona Walls. I'm a research assistant professor at the Bio5 Institute at the University of Arizona. And since we have people from all over the world, that's in Tucson, Arizona, which is in the southeastern part of the United States. And one of the most beautiful places on earth, in my opinion. Having been many places, I still feel that way. So the research in my lab focuses on semantic data integration. That is, we use ontologies to bring together data from different sources. I work most in life sciences very broadly, and that includes projects in biodiversity, in agriculture and environmental health, plant breeding, museoarchaeology, and biomedicine. I even work on some projects, a project related to space situational awareness, though that project doesn't deal with any physical samples at this point. For many years before starting my own lab, I worked at Cyverse, which was formerly known as the iPlant Collaborative. Some of you may have heard of that. That's a large NSF-funded cyber infrastructure project for life sciences within the U.S., though it has users all over the world. I was the product champion for the Cyverse Data Commons, which meant that I did things like research and write data policies, supporting users in data management, led the development of a data repository that issued DOIs, and I curated all of the incoming public data. So in addition to, sort of doing my own research in biology and data integration, I've done a lot with data infrastructure and data management as well. So I'm active in several life sciences standards organizations, including TADWIG, which, if you're not familiar with it, stands for Biodiversity Information Standards, as well as the Genomic Standards Consortium and the Open Biological and Biomedical, or OBO Foundry. OBO Foundry is not technically a standards organization, but we share many of the same goals in terms of, developing best practices and shared usage and methods across different groups. The kinds of data that I work with in my data integration research include trait data, things like, morphological or phenological traits, environmental data, including physicochemical parameters and biodiversity data, genetic and genomic sequencing data. And I think a really key point here is that all of the data, even though I don't go out and collect samples myself, all of these data that I work with are derived from physical samples. And nearly all of them also have a really important environmental context that's linked to the location. So without metadata about them, you can't really understand the samples and the data. Sarah had asked me briefly to talk about the challenges and issues in my discipline. I think many of you will be familiar with this, but since I have the stage for one moment, I will say that I think the biggest challenge facing life sciences around physical samples right now is the inability to link sample data, samples to derived data and products like subsamples and images. And the number one thing keeping that from being possible is the lack of globally unique, permanent, and resolvable identifiers for samples in life sciences. We have many different systems of identifiers in biology, but none of them, or very few of them, I should say, meet the requirements of a good permanent identifier. And so therefore, I actually devote a lot of my research effort to trying to solve that problem, working with people like Kirsten and Jens. So without those identifiers, we can't solve a lot of the other really pressing problems, which include things like adoption and compliance with existing metadata standards, the sustainability of the different data resources in life science, and of course the discoverability and reuse of existing data. So that's my 2 cents to start with.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Sean, do you want to say something about the situation of physical artifacts in archaeology? Sean?
That was Sean's mic making that static noise. That
Yeah.
wasn't a good sign.
Okay.
He says, okay, he says, sorry, just a sec.
I see him. And I see that he's talking, but I don't hear anything. Ah.
No. Audio's not working.
Okay, how about that one?
Ah, yes.
Yay!
Fantastic.
Okay. I don't know. this works. I accidentally walked to my computer this morning and realized I'd had to boot into Windows, which just never works for my audio on this computer. And anyway, at least this one is working, so that's fine. Okay, so basically, it's for some background from myself, where I'm coming at this from. I have run in the for some time a field project in Bulgaria on that's a large-scale landscape and paleoenvironments project. So, you know, in that sense, we work regularly with samples of the kind that I put in the chart. And archaeology is, I guess, a very typical discipline in like Christine Borgman's small science domains. We use lots of different kinds of data, you know, often not in huge amounts, but very heterogeneous, diverse data that archaeologists, I'd say, aren't, you know, archaeology isn't really quite yet up to managing. So, for example, when we're doing a landscape project like I've got, I think the buzz phrase that our paleoecologist uses is you know, multi-proxy paleoenvironmental reconstructions. We use, you know, soil samples, cores from lakes and wetlands, speleothems, you know, all sorts of stuff. And then when we get into excavations, we'll take all sorts of samples. So that's part of my background. Is in field work like that. And then the other part is that since 2012, I've been running a project to develop field data recording systems for archaeology and other and other field research-based disciplines. So I dropped in a couple of references into the notes that are just from a relatively recent edition of Advances in Archaeological Practice, which is a publication of the Society for American Archaeology. And they just kind of show that archaeologists are not very good yet at reusing reusing one another's data. That a lot of data, and there are a number of bottlenecks across this. You know, one of the biggest is the production of digital data in the first place, which archaeologists tend to still collect mostly on paper and maybe with an ad hoc mix of, you know, a spreadsheet here and, you know, a FileMaker database there, a lot of use of ArcGIS. But then there's also a well-established tendency in archaeology to overemphasize the methods and the field work and underplan the research. So underplan the research design and recording in particular. And this is documented all the way back to the late 60s, early 70s. And this means that that projects finish after a major 3 to 5 year series of field campaigns, and there's an enormous digitization effort that's required that many projects don't do. Or that it just takes a long time. And I mean, my project's no exception to that. It's taking the field work that we did from 2008 to 2011 that inspired us to want to start FAMES, the field acquired information management systems, the digital recordings, is because we were so frustrated with the the options at the time. But because of these things, the domain-specific repositories we have, which we have, and we have some are I don't know, underutilized. You know, that a lot of projects never produce the comprehensive digital data sets to put into them. And then there's, you know, the best evidence that's coming up now as people are looking at reuse is that they're also not heavily used. That these sorts of things haven't gone beyond the early adopter, you know, cohort in archaeology yet. So I'm, you know, I guess my own interests are really in, you know, overcoming these socio-technical problems and using, you know, you know, not rebuilding the final thing I'll say about this, archaeology also has a horrible not invented here syndrome, like that getting them to use infrastructure developed in other domains can be a challenge as well. So I think a lot of our problems are socio-technical, and in as much as they're technical, it's about how do you manage, such heterogeneous, data sets as what, a large landscape or excavation project would, would produce. So, I mean, I think that, that certain things are in place. Like we do have our domain-specific repositories. My project and other projects are working on the field data collection. There's not been a lot of work so far on a science gateway, a virtual lab, or the thing that would go in between. But I think one of the things that we're really behind on, that I would identify as sort of as a major problem, is dealing with physical samples. We deal with so many, even whether or not you want to count artifacts in this category. Like if we count artifacts, then we've got an even bigger problem. In that, I mean, one excavation that I was on in the 90s, we had 23 tons of ceramics, come out of that project. So, the artifacts are increases by an order of magnitude, but even the physical samples, the ad hoc precarious ways that physical samples are handled on projects are a real problem. And I think that we're really not getting the best, use out of them, and projects that work in the same region. I mean, our project, we took bulk soil samples, over what, 300 or 400 square kilometer area to do some erosion modeling and soil fertility and stuff like that. And I mean, they're in our data set, but they're going into open context, which is one of our domain-specific repositories, and I'm not sure who else would find those. I know our palynologist puts his samples into the palynology database that I've forgotten the name of now, but he says it's the right place for it. I'm sorry, I'm just not enough coffee yet this morning. I'm blanking on what it's called. But anyway, trying to move towards more of a culture where physical samples become a first-class, a category of evidence, in that they're often collected by archaeological scientists who are not sort of the directors of the project, but they're called in as specialists, and the directors are often more interested in the ceramics or the architecture or whatever they're doing. Making sure that they have first-class status, and building out the ecosystem across the entire data life cycle to facilitate their management. And then the rest of it is a socio-technical issue of outreach, engagement, training for archaeologists. So, and some countries are rather ahead. I think that's really been recognized in Britain, that needs to change, like that the approaches to digital archaeology need to change. In Australia, it hasn't. Yeah, there's some variation there, but I've talked enough. I'll turn it over, and if anyone's got any questions, I'm happy to follow up.
Thank you, Sean. Catherine, do you want to say something about the geosciences?
Well, yes, yes and no, because I also think that
you have to decide yes or no.
I think you can give something specific on what's going on in geology, and then argue with Sean as to whether geologists are worse than archaeologists.
Yeah, no, that's, I mean, I was actually going to start with, just listening to Ramona and Sean on, the commonalities in the challenges that we have. And, as many of you know, I started many years ago the IGSN because, just to present a little bit of background, I was building data systems for geochemical data. I mean, data generated by analytical measurements on rocks, on volcanic rocks, on metamorphic rocks, and so on. And one of the biggest frustrations was that you couldn't figure out from publications if data in 2 different publications belong to the same sample. And that's what people wanted to know. They wanted to have, certain types of chemical properties integrated with other types of chemical properties, let's say, isotope ratios and trace element contents in these samples. And that basically could only be solved through a unique identifier. And so we started it at that time with exactly the same frustrations. And when I hear Sean talk about the difficulty of bringing it to the people, of changing the culture, then I have to say that was the biggest challenge, was over 15 years to and do an incredible amount of outreach, of trying to convince these different stakeholders that I talked about initially, from curators of core repositories to researchers to people who generate data systems for sample-based data, to all change basically the way they were doing things, adopt a common persistent identifier for these samples. And I think in the earth sciences, we have made some big strides in this. The IGSN as a unique identifier for samples has moved forward. I've just, a couple of days ago, I've checked in our data repository, and about 1/3 of the data sets now reference the samples by IGSN. So that's a major step forward. But it is still a challenge to get the right metadata. We are insular in some ways still with the way we describe samples. We need to integrate that into more cross-disciplinary and encompassing vocabularies that can be used across different domains. So that's what I consider one of the challenges. Okay, sorry, this is working at home. Okay. And it's dinner time here, so
yep.
There's a hungry family in the background. Yeah. And so we have, I think, with the IGSN established or created a concept that other domains have found interesting and have looked into. And I think I mentioned the IGSN 2040 project that has actually brought together some of these domains, including archaeology, biodiversity, and so on, trying to figure out how to run a system like this in a cross-disciplinary and sustainable manner. Jens, Leslie, help me if I left anything fundamental.
Well, I think what is also characteristic of dealing with samples in geology, like in many other sciences, that there's a range of practices. There are groups that are very well organized, like the ocean drilling programs and continental drilling programs. And then there's the individual scientist who takes a drive out into the hills, into a quarry, picks up a few stones. Don't tell them they pick up stones, they'll stone you. And then puts them on the shelf and or in the drawer. So we have the whole spread of practices, and I see a pattern there that is very similar to the way people deal with data, that where they need to cooperate to get anything done, like in these large cooperative projects and programs, that they have practices and they have formalized data exchange to a greater degree, and then you have the areas where you can still work as an individual, and then people work as individuals.
I mean, I think one of the lessons that we've also learned in geology, where we started to work with so many different stakeholders, one of the stakeholders has been the publishing world, and trying to bring these best practices to journals, to author guidelines, where there is actually a growing awareness that samples should have persistent unique identifiers, but it still is not a very common and broadly adopted practice to publish data for samples with any persistent identifiers. And there's a generational change there that we, yes, I see a hand, but it's not the blue one. So am I?
Yeah, sorry, just physically raising my hand.
But that's, sorry, before we let you speak, please use the blue hand symbol, because that alerts us and it puts you in the right order. So especially if you don't use video, we wouldn't see your hand. And so please use the blue hand symbol to raise your hand. Ramona, and after Ramona, I quickly want to say something about the situation in CSIRO, which I think is pretty remarkable in terms of interdisciplinary application. But Ramona, go.
I just wanted to respond to Kirsten's comment about, you know, adoption by the community and working with publishers and sort of the perspective from biology. When most publishers started to require that you could not publish any paper about sequence data until you had the sequences registered at NCBI, and you had to supply then the sequence, the biosample IDs for those. That was a game changer in terms of getting people to actually deposit their sequences. Unfortunately, what it didn't change is getting people to record the metadata about the samples that generated those sequences. They have to register that. You can't submit the sequence without first registering your sample. But we've learned that, first of all, biosample identifiers don't make very good identifiers for physical samples. They could, it's not the nature of the identifier themselves, it's the infrastructure behind it. And two, without any enforcement of the metadata there's still a huge gap in terms of being able to actually solve the same problem Kirsten mentioned. Were these two things taken, are these two samples the same? We can't know that, you know, because those same samples will have different identifiers in the museums where they've been deposited that they didn't record in their biosample metadata. So that was my point.
Thank you.
Ramona, can I just interrupt before I go too much further? I'm the note taker. I actually had to step out to deal with something at home, and so I missed getting notes, your key points. So if you go to the bottom of page 4, and I put a note in the chat box about this as well, but you're obviously not reading the chat box, but don't let that worry you.
I think I responded to you in the chat box, Leslie.
Oh, did you? Oh, I'm not following. I'm taking notes, not following the chat box.
But I will copy my notes into the notes document then.
Thanks. Right. Great. Okay. Sorry. Okay. Back on track.
Just as a different perspective, I quickly want to report on what CSIRO is doing with respect to physical samples. So CSIRO is the Commonwealth Scientific and Industrial Research Organization. It's Australia's research organization and covers almost anything in science and engineering. And that kind of tells you the spectrum of applications and samples that you will find. And a lot of the digital infrastructure work is supported by our information management and technology division. And what I find quite remarkable is that about 2 years ago, IM&T worked with some of the large collections, and there are about a couple of dozen collections in CSIRO. Some of them are large national collections like the insect collection or wildlife collection. And to get everybody on the same page with respect to technology and introduce sample management and collection management across the organization. That has been difficult because the requirements are so diverse, but I think it's quite remarkable to see that you can do this, that you can roll out collection management, sample management across such a diverse organization, and adapting it to the specific needs of a community and discipline. And so while we often see this tendency of the not invented here and I'm special, in the framework of such a transdisciplinary organization, it is possible to roll out infrastructure that supports something as specific as the management of physical samples.
So you're just trying to make us all jealous now, Jens.
Well, it's still a very hard work, and
Okay.
I won't go into the detail of some of the things where you think like, oh my God, what are they doing?
That I mean, from my perspective, you know, what we're trying to do here in the interest group is to have that convergence and establish, you know, practices that can be adopted in other communities. Would you then say that, you know, the interest group here really needs to focus on the adoption, on the education that
it's also partly having the conversation about what is specific and what is common, and to find the right balance of what is common, what can be standardized, and what needs to be specific and be kept specific. Ramona, you
so I wanted to touch on a point Sean made, maybe draw him back into the conversation too, which is something that I think is common, which is the lack of focus on the people going, everybody wants to run out and do the collection and do the field work, but and Sean, I'm sorry if I misquote you here, but you know, people don't plan beforehand for all of the work that needs to come after you've collected the samples, and to all that digitization and organization and metadata, right? And that needs to be really a cultural shift where people, and the funding organizations are doing a nice job at least requiring people to write data management plans, sort of forcing them to think about it a little bit beforehand, but there's still a lot more that needs to happen in that regard. And I think that is a transdisciplinary problem that all of us have experienced.
At this point, I also would like to invite everybody in this forum to contribute, because we're not so many. I think it will be easy, and if things go out of hand, I will simply mute everybody and restart the discussion.
Yeah, I was actually going to ask, is there anybody on who does not fit into the 3 domains that we have represented here and could add a different perspective?
And who isn't too shy to say something?
Hello.
Adrian.
Oh, it's Adrian.
Okay.
Talking about not being shy. I've never been criticised for being too shy. We are the ARDC, Australian Research Data Commons, is a research infrastructure program that cuts across a number of disciplines. And in one sense, we're the perfect complement to the CSIRO in that we provide services across the broader academic sector in Australia, including the CSIRO, but in the same way that Jens was saying, you know, they're dealing with all the different sort of sample communities within the CSIRO. You know, we are providing support across the university sector in Australia, so we do pick up people like Sean is a great collaborator of ours, works with the ARDC on a number of things, as well as people from the marine science and terrestrial ecosystem research people. And in one sense, we don't have the domain background in any of those, and we're trying to provide some of the fundamental services like the identifier service across that. So any bridges that can be built, you know, we certainly see that, you know, that's one of the things that we face is trying to work out what the shared requirements are, what the cultural sort of context around an identifier service and, you know, the technology-based identifier service, what are the different cultural, meaning policy, education, skills, sort of procedures, and the other stuff that sits around and the identifier part of it, us trying to cohere that across a number of universities, across all the disciplines and departments that are supported in the university system is, you know, that's the challenge for us, is to try and get, you know, cut through and see what the core parts are and how we can facilitate conversations across the domains and still provide something of value in the center there. So nothing more to add in there other than to sort of underpin what Jens was saying there, that it's a great opportunity and we're well placed there to be part of this conversation, but actually doing it is, you know, these kind of forums, you know, are quite important for us.
Thanks, Adrian. So we've had a few quite different perspectives as researchers, infrastructure providers. I don't know how to characterize ARDC, that it's kind of facilitator in some ways. You're not a funder, I know. You always say that.
Are they not infrastructure providers?
To an extent.
Okay.
But we have a very broad view of what infrastructure means, and a lot of it around the social infrastructure, as well as, you know, the policies and the skills and the, as well as the technical infrastructure. And that's probably where our, you know, where the touch point with this community is the provision of persistent identifier infrastructure. But then we build out from them.
A question that interests me and that I think goes beyond the identifier question is this: what are the commonalities and where are the things that remain specific? So if we want to build services that add value, what is that value? For these kind of cross-disciplinary ambitions that we have, what would it be that would really move the community forward, or the communities? Here we've heard of 4, 5 maybe. There are dozens, many that we haven't heard about. What do we want to achieve? That's also a question for,
end, right?
Yeah.
Okay, good.
I get. Just to finish my sentence, so it's also a question of where do we want to take this interest group? What is it that we want to achieve? Gary.
Thanks, Jens. I just wanted to answer your question briefly and say that one of the struggles that I've been experiencing and am interested in trying to get accomplished for that is to sort of make collections data and sample data more proximal to the research data themselves. And so my job as the Chief Information Officer for the Geological Survey here in the state of Indiana is to build novel cyber infrastructure that allows for the research data product, so the publications with the samples, and then the management and the loaning of the research data with the particular IGSNs that go along with those sorts of things. So I've actually just gotten funding to sort of build an open access system a free and open source system for the collections management for institutional repositories and museums like where I work in a geological survey, but also pairing that with a digital asset management system. So that way we are actually building the connection to the global samples registration infrastructure into the registration environment where it works on a local level. But we're actually pretty excited that this is something that I'm working to build in a containerized and entirely replicable infrastructure that can then be the infrastructure that has the ontology, the schema, and the individual relationships between your particular research environment and that of a global collaborative community can be shared amongst the broader community as a whole. So by making the infrastructure for the management of the physical samples in a CMS available next to the IGSN allocation agent within our own local infrastructure, and then bundling that with the system that our researchers use in order to interact with the derivatives of those samples, like the photographs or the PXRF geochemical analyses, or the all the other sort of derived data samples. We're building that into the infrastructure right off the bat. And so if there are others that are interested in sort of working together to sort of harden out that infrastructure with the registration of sample numbers right alongside digital assets in a digital asset management system, that's something where my team and I will be expending a fair bit of effort over the next year in earnest. And so it would be a pretty good way to perhaps concrete an answer to your question there, Jens.
Yeah, thanks, Gary. So from what I just heard from you, one of the things that maybe this group should do, besides reaching out to more communities and get a broader disciplinary scope, is also to work with other RDA groups besides the work with other RDA groups that work on different aspects of the science graph, because in the end what we're dealing with here is physical artifacts that are part of that science graph and kind of an anchor into reality. But we need things like how is this graph constructed? What vocabularies and metadata do we need to fit into? How does it all fit into this ecosystem of knowledge exchange? Is this a direction that we should be moving towards, or that we should pay more attention to?
Which groups in RDA are working on that?
Well, there's, for instance, the Open Science Graph, whatever status group. There's the persistent identifiers for instruments. Then there's various things around data citation. I think there are links to all of these activities, because many of the activities in science are in the end underpinned by an experiment that's been done on a physical object.
So, I mean, this could we're actually with that kind of already moving into that last agenda item, right? The future activities in some way. Would that be a good topic for a session at the next RDA? Or would it make more sense, what do people feel, to actually run a series of virtual meetings inviting different interest groups or working groups from RDA to present about their activities, expectations, requirements for integrating physical samples into their specific, constructs?
I think that could be useful. I think the main, in terms of benefiting this interest group, we have to be careful about spreading ourselves too thin. And so the advantage we would get from that would be to make sure that we're raising awareness in those other groups that there are the physical samples are part of data, right?
Yeah.
So in a way to try to get them to manage the parts of RDA that deal with physical samples, but not the parts of RDA that are not explicitly physical sample oriented, but that have impact on physical samples, right? So if you're doing, if you're on the science graph, just let the science graph team make sure that there's some accommodation for physical samples in that graph.
Everybody, this is Ted Haberman.
Mm-hmm.
Hi, Ted.
Interesting talk so far. And Jens brought up the identifiers, persistent identifiers for instruments, which is a group that I've been involved with. And I think that one of the things that we've been discussing in that group, or that maybe helped us move forward, was distinguishing between instrument metadata and metadata for identifiers of instruments. And in the sample business, I think it's also very similar. We have complex, many times custom metadata and data associated with samples. And then we have these identifiers that we're trying to maintain a more of a common and maybe even I don't want to say minimal metadata. It's maximal metadata for the identifiers themselves, and then in many of the metadata standards that are around these days, there's a possibility of making a pointer, a sort of standard pointer to more detailed metadata about this thing, and that could be a pointer to a metadata file or resource somewhere, or it could, certainly we're also familiar with landing pages. So I think in terms of working together across groups in RDA, sort of, standardizing on this metadata for identifiers is relatively simple compared to standardizing either on metadata for samples or metadata for instruments or metadata for software or metadata for data sets or, all of those other things. So I think that's an area where agreement is sort of rather straightforward, and then or comparatively straightforward. And I think we're also seeing that now when things like IGSN are thinking about sort of using handles or DOIs for samples, and the instrument group is sort of thinking about using DOIs for instruments. And so the big identifier repository infrastructures are managing that identifier metadata, and then the communities can focus more on domain-specific metadata. So I think that was a helpful thing in the instrument identifier.
Ed, sorry, you went a bit too quick. You started out with a statement by saying you separated identifiers for instruments from what? What was the other one?
No, we separated metadata for identifiers, which really is metadata for any kind of identifier, from metadata for instruments. metadata for instruments is as complicated as metadata for samples. And there's things like SensorML and other groups that have tried to standardize that. But metadata for identifiers looks a lot like data site metadata, and it's pretty simple and cross-discipline, as long as you realize that you may need to compromise when it comes to clear definitions or super specific things, like the instrument guys have something called owner, and the question is that really that different from something like hosting institution? And and there it's a code list thing, it's not a structure thing. But anyway, yeah, so metadata for instruments, metadata for samples, metadata for data sets, metadata for software, all very complicated. Metadata for identifiers, pretty simple.
I wonder if I can draw Simon Cox into this conversation.
That's usually really, really hard to do, to get him to say anything.
I tried, but he doesn't even move.
Because
he's got a weak ass excuse for video.
So Simon and I a while back did some work on looking at what happens in a lab, and I found that very helpful and instructive to see how we can describe the processes or procedures that we do in scientific analysis and systematic descriptions, and making this in a semantically rich way, which then again touches on identifiers. So I was wondering whether Simon could say something about that.
Maybe Simon doesn't have a microphone or something.
I've got a microphone.
You do?
Oh, hello.
What, are you in the playground?
You can do nice things with Zoom, Kirsten. But yeah, I mean, I've been listening. As somebody who doesn't normally handle physical samples, I could sit. I'm sort of sitting in on here, really listening to the conversations through two lenses. One is the persistent identifier story, and that's something which Jens in particular has done a lot of reasonably deep thinking about, and has got a pretty coherent story about that. And Ted's comments just, I think, about the metadata for identifiers also speaks to that concern. The piece of the puzzle which really was where I got into this a long time ago, I'll try not to even guess how many years, was when I was just trying to kind of deconstruct what it is that happens in assay labs, in particular with the idea that what goes into the machine that goes ping is often been related by quite a lot of pre-processing, quite a lot of processing steps to the thing that's actually been collected out in the field. And there'll be a whole load of intermediate phases for these things, some of which are, each of which will generate some physical artifact along the way, but which in many cases won't be curated, might be destroyed as part of the development of the next artifact. So with crushing and separating and all of those kinds of things that happen to mineral samples, at least. So, while trying to not go down too many rat holes. By the way, when I first started looking at that, we were talking to assay labs who basically embedded a lot of that history of physical samples into these arcane identifier strings that had, you add yet another little letter or number or tag on the end of the sample identifier, and somebody who knows how that lab works can read that and understand that there's a whole bunch of processes, which is can get very specific, very detailed, and is incredibly important to the to understanding the data that comes out of those samples. But what we're really interested in doing here is in generalizing and in getting some patterns out which maybe are reusable even within, for example, the geochemistry world, but then potentially over into the kind of subjects that Ramona and Sean deal with in Ramona's space. You're typically looking at pieces of organisms, for example, and characterizing, and what's the relationship of those to the other things. The most recent work that I've done in that space was a little document that's recently been published as a W3C working draft. I think I just sent it to Ted, and I meant to send it to everyone. I've just put the link in the chat here, and probably the most interesting bit of this would be actually this figure 3. So if you click the second of those links that I just sent to you, you get straight through to a kind of worked example, and this is all building on the idea that a sample has a relationship to other things, and that's the essence of its sampleness, if you like, as well as the whole kind of processing chain. Now you'll see, if you're able to click through to that, the green boxes in that figure, each of those notionally is a physical sample. In some cases, it won't have survived the next processing stage, but it did at some point. Now, I made this one up, and it may not pass the lab test of people who really work in labs, but I think it's simplified. But those red the one relationship that existed in the SSN ontology, as it was published by W3C and OGC 3 years ago, the one relationship that was present there was just the is sample of relationship. In this paper here, the extensions we added the red ones, and those kind of give you anchors back to the things which probably you think you want to be talking about, and the things which people who are coming and looking for physical samples or for data about physical samples might be wanting to, that'll be the key in their query, in their search query. There's some other concerns in this paper, Jens, and you're scrolling through those at the moment, primarily around collection.
It's me who's scrolling.
But this figure 3 is the one which I think is primarily relevant to the discussions here.
Hey, Simon, can you hear me?
Yes.
Ramona raised her hand, though.
Well, it's okay. If Ted's question is relevant to this, he can ask it first. It's on a new topic.
Okay. So thank you, Ramona. I'm looking at this figure 3, and in the lower left-hand corner, there's some big long sample number that comes from that sample interval 65. Does it? Is that what as original sample means? That means that sample interval 65 is the original sample of that other one?
It's the it's been a month or two since I worked up at this. It's the one that arrived in the lab.
Sample interval 65 did.
Yeah, if you see what I mean.
Okay.
Yeah.
Now, to a certain extent, there's some arbitrariness here, and it's what the cataloger of the sample chooses to highlight as being the thing which they want people to understand the machines to be attempting to characterize.
Yeah. So
Okay.
what I'm just trying to figure out why sample interval 65 is not connected to the feature of interest.
It is
and
the feature of interest because there's a chain starting from
okay.
the outcrop and the core taken from the outcrop and the interval taken from the core.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Thanks.
And
Sorry.
not all of the potential relationships are shown here. Okay, every one of those samples at the left or at any stage across that diagram has original sample relationships to earlier ones.
Yeah.
Okay, this is a very selective thing to tell a bit of a story.
Okay, great.
Okay? But
Thanks.
the point here is that what we were trying to figure out was how few semantic properties might be useful in order to be expressive enough for most discovery and description applications. And at the moment, there's 4 different relationships there. There's this sample of, has original sample, has sampled feature, and has ultimate feature of interest. Okay, 4 is still a lot, but and Ramona would probably look at this through the lens of OBO and the relations ontology there, and think about how you might. And all of these would be way too specific for the relationship.
Yeah, we would have much more general relationships that would derive the same information.
You get these by chaining those somehow, and with some notion of what some of the intermediate classifications would be. This is more of an application than pure logic in that sense, Ramona.
But I think that this feeds back into what I was saying. I mean, basically what you've got here is sort of a generic lineage model.
Yeah.
And there's a bunch of generic lineage models of essentially input, output, and process step.
Yeah.
And the identifiers of those samples allow you to plug plug those samples into a very generic lineage model.
Absolutely. And what I think what I was trying to do here is say, well, a generic process or lineage model is absolutely what underpins this. But in the context of samples and sampling and physical samples, which of course is the topic of this meeting that we're having now, that there are some common relationships which are useful in this much narrower context than general process flow or lineage of things in general. This is about samples and why samples, what the semantics of samples and sampling is. Samples and sampling is about trying to bring something into the lab or store it in a museum, which supports science. In other words, is representative of something in the world which you're attempting to characterize.
Okay, so Ramona, and then we have to end.
Let me make one point before we end. I'm going to assert my hand raise privilege here, because there was an important point put in the chat that I just want to make sure it doesn't get lost. From Siddhiswara saying this was a long time ago about something that's important for this group to discuss. Probably a common way to represent and exchange sample data. I agree with Siddhiswara that that's potentially a very important topic for this discussion. I just want to make sure that's captured in the notes.
Yeah, and it's something that I raised early in this discussion, and it will come up again and again. I think that we need to work on what are the commonalities, how do we find those commonalities, and where do we need to create pathways to convey the specifics, and how do we do that? Sorry, Ted, we're running out of time, so I'll just hand over to Kerstin to say what she wants to do next.
No, before you hand over, can someone copy the chat?
Yeah,
exactly.
someone copy
I
the
haven't
chat
even
into
been
the
able
notes.
to see the chat. I can't see the chat.
Can someone copy the chat and put it in the notes, please?
That was
I'll do
I'll do
question.
that. I'll do that.
Okay, right. Sorry. Go, Kirsten.
Yes, no, this is great discussion. And, I mean, we have at this meeting here, we kind of missed all the material scientists and the engineers who would probably have a very different perspective because they produce the samples from different materials. It's kind of different. And so, but it shows this diversity that we're dealing with, where even the concepts of why does this sample exist play a role. So I think it's very fascinating. But what we haven't really done, and there's only a minute left, is think about where to go. And maybe this idea that was brought up in Helsinki of collecting use cases needs to be further pursued. It's just really not a good start to just say, oh, let's collect use cases. In some way, we need to be more specific on what we're after, and what the goal is for these use cases to be contributed. So ideas are more than welcome. We can hold more of these meetings. I think it's critical for this group to meet more often than just every 6 months at an RDA plenary. And as we're getting used to meeting virtually, I think it's not going to be as much of a problem anymore. It's sad to not see you and to not give you a hug, as I usually do with everybody. I'm going to have to really get used to a different word. But just as a last statement, I still really want to encourage, and we know we have few people left, but maybe these people can reach out to others to help refresh our leadership here in the group. It's been the same people from the beginning, and I think it's really critical that we get some younger folks in here, and maybe also a bit more diversity. We're very earth science heavy in this group, and
Australian heavy.
And Australian heavy. And so, I mean, really, we need nominations from the community and self-nominations to make a bit of change here. But with that, I would like to thank everybody who stayed on for the hour and a half. It was a great discussion. I think we're getting the hang of it to a certain degree. Next time I want access to the chat, but
you need to push on the 3 little dots, Kirsten, up in the upper right-hand corner, and then chat comes out.
No, then I can. Oh,
we've got the chat. We've got the chat.
No, yeah, I mean, it's just because I'm presenting, it doesn't show up, right? Because I'm sharing my screen, that makes the difference. Anyway, thank you all. Any other comments, please enter into the notes. They are accessible, and we're going to link them up from the webpage about this meeting. And please contribute ideas where this group can be most efficient, most impactful for anything that RDA is doing and that you're doing with respect to sample data management. Okay, any last words from Jens, Leslie, Simon as the co-chairs here?
Well, thank you very much to everybody contributing to the session.
Thanks to everyone.
Yeah, specifically Ramona and Sean for your comments. Yes, and everybody else. And keep healthy. Stay healthy.
Especially.
That's all that matters at the moment.
Yep.
Stay safe.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Trying our best.